Please join me in welcoming to the CMX Summit virtual main stage, Jay Washington. Welcome, Jay. It's such a pleasure to have you.
Oh, thank you so much, Beth. I am truly honored and excited to be here.
Take it away.
Oh, yes. Okay. Well, first of all, before we get into all of the rigmarole, I just want to take a moment to express my extreme gratitude to David Spink, CMX, Bevy, and every individual involved in making this much needed and necessary space happen. It's so valuable to me. Community has always been a part of my world, and to be able to have a conversation in a space filled with individuals who get it is just an honor and a blessing. So thank you. Next slide, please. Yeah. So, as Beth mentioned, my talk is community more than a commodity. And I think for those here, most of you get that. But I think it's worth visiting and talking about the value of community, not from the standpoint of metrics, but more importantly, from the standpoint of its presence in humans' lives and as a segue to humans' lives business for as long as humans have been around. Next slide, please. To give some context of who I am, as Beth mentioned, I am the senior community manager for Headspace. I've been rocking this community road for 20 years, 20 long and fruitful years. And I'm here to tell you that it's an honor and a privilege to have a real conversation. We're going to get real in community. Oftentimes, we have to be a little bit diplomatic for those who don't understand community. But this conversation is for all of us. And so, in this space, I want to talk about community as it stands in the world today. But before we do that, I'd like to honor where I work and what it has offered me. Next slide, please. I'd like for us to host really quickly to get focused on the conversation at hand, a 3-minute focused meditation that will allow us to have our minds right for this conversation. So sitting comfortably or getting comfortable, whatever that means for you. If it's sitting in a chair, feet firmly planted on the floor, hands if you're in your lap if you'd like. And if you're so inclined, maybe place your hand on your belly to be clear that you are a living, breathing human being. And let's begin.
So sitting comfortably, just taking a big deep breath in through the nose, out through the mouth. As you breathe in, noticing how the body expands. As you breathe out, just watching the body soften as you gently close the eyes. And rather than the mind leading the breath, allow the breath to lead the mind. Notice the sensation of the breath. Notice it where you feel it in the body. If you need to, you can just gently place your hand on the stomach. And just following that rising and falling sensation. Nothing else to do. Allowing thoughts to come and go. And when you're ready, just gently opening the eyes again.
Woo! That puts me in a space of not only gratitude, but focus and intention. And again, that's Andy Puddicombe, founder of Headspace. Lots of our content on the website if you're interested. Next slide, please. In the beginning, there was community. So again, as community managers, most of you will get this. But my hope is that in sharing this talk, we will be able to provide insight to those who are unfamiliar. And for those who are familiar, get a little bit of acknowledgement of truth. Coming into this space, we are all both teachers and students, and I hope to share a little bit of wisdom while learning something from you. Next slide, please. So in the beginning, there was community. For as far back as we can remember, community has been an intrinsic part of the human experience. And as history would also tell us, community in business spaces have always been. If you think of one example, bartering, Bartering was a real connector in community that allowed people to do business with this level of trust and understanding, reliance and resilience that, again, very much a part of the community experience. Next slide, please. I wonder, as we think about communities, as we think about the many ways throughout history community has shown up, whether that be because of geography, whether that be because of similar languages or skills, community has always been a part of our human experience. And I'd love to find out from you all if you would name a community in which you are a member, just to give everyone an idea of how broad the reach of community is as human beings. Just quickly throw in there a community that you are a member of. I'm a member of the Headspace community. That's the first thing that came to my mind. Both a member of mindfulness and meditation as a practice in which we become more focused on the present. Let's see what we got going here. What we got? Member of what community? Rock climbing community. You're a brave soul. You're a brave soul. Yoga. I feel that. Yoga. Blockchain. I need to learn about blockchain. So, yeah, I feel like most of you get it. You know, community, again, has been a part of the human experience for as long as humans have had an experience, for that matter. Next slide, please. But for us, you know, historically, community has been a group of people with diverse characteristics who are linked by social ties, share common goals or perspectives, and engage in joint action. But today, I'd like to provide us a more intentional definition of community. And as community management becomes a real presence in the B2B space, I'd like for us to dig a little bit deeper from that historical definition, leaning more towards the anthropological lens, to really understand that community presents us an opportunity, not only in the business space, but in the human space, to be more involved. Next slide, please. So for us, communities are structures of broad and deep empowerment. They help individual members feel seen and heard. And when they feel valued, they're less worried about being vulnerable and more likely to share their experiences, knowledge, and perspectives. And so, again, as community members or as community folk, I know you all get this, but I want to be really intentional about this definition because as we move to the natural byproduct of ROI, of metrics, of KRs, this definition will dictate how we get there. Next slide, please. So let's first start with the science of community. For me, the real beginning of community is from an understanding of what social sciences are included in this conversation. Next slide. The first one for me is social trust. I think it's the foundation. Trust is a foundation for any relationship, any successful, sustainable relationship. And so, as we talk about community, before we can delve into metrics, before we can explore all those measurements that will determine if said community is successful, let's start with a solid foundation, social trust. According to the European Social Survey, the ESS, social trust contributes to a very wide range of phenomenons that includes economic growth, efficiencies in marketing, stable and efficient democratic government. So this idea of social trust is really important as we think about community and its constructs. Next slide, please. You know, community, when managed well, is the mechanism for establishing and extending social trust. And so I would love, as we talk about community outside of the lens of community management, for those cross-functional teams who are really looking to understand the value of community, that we start with the basics. Trust, having the ability to offer our customers, partners, stakeholders, a real trust value within us so that they then show up to the table as their authentic selves, ready to have conversations that can often be hard, challenging, real. But in those spaces, that's where the magic of community takes over and we progress to something valuable. Next slide, please. Also, social impact. That word, that phrase has been floating around, business spaces for some time now. And to define it, it's the effect on people and communities that happens as a result of action or inaction, projects, policies, programs. And for me, what I really appreciate about social impact is that it offers us a window into the world of the conscious consumer. Like, conscious consumerism is now a real thing. I think it's always been a thing, but it now has a name and a term that, encompasses this idea that consumers are now very intentional about aligning themselves from a brand loyalty standpoint with organizations that have a stance when it comes to social responsibility. Next slide. I was thinking about there was a Deloitte Global Millennial Survey back in 2017, and the stat was almost 9 out of 10 millennials, 86%, believe that financial performance shouldn't be the only yardstick of business success. Rather, social impact should take priority. And in sitting in that space and thinking about all the brands that I support based on how they show up in the world, I can't deny that to be a fact or truth. And so, if this is to be true, I'd like for us to think about how organizations are really intentionally showing up in spaces where they can show their social impact as a way of connecting with the communities they serve. I think of Trader Joe's for me when I think about an organization and social impact. But recently in the news, organizations like Airbnb offering, 20K Afghan refugees housing for free. That's how an organization shows up leveraging its social impact. I also think about the organization I work for, Headspace, offering educators K through 12 free access to our app, because mental health in those spaces, like in many spaces throughout our world as a result of the pandemic, have created a real need for tools to help managing mental health and stress. And so, looking for you guys to sort of share with me, name a brand you support because of their social impact. You got any? I see Airbnb. I work with them a lot. I'm a traveler at heart, so Airbnb for sure. Let's see who else we got. Anyone? Anyone? Amazon? Oh wait, intentional. Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation, my friend. Ruby, that's a whole nother conversation. So yeah, tons of brands out there. Headspace, yes. Microsoft, yes. All of these organizations recognize the value of having a real presence in the social space and showing the communities that they serve that they're just not about talking about their value, but also showing their extended value by supporting organizations who have a real social presence. Patagonia, I go with them too. Patagonia. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the business case of community. Again, we're all well aware of how community is involved in literally anything that humans are a part of, because we are intrinsically wired to connect with each other, innately, inherently wired to connect with each other. So the idea of community is not foreign. Our work communities are places that we show up in every day, coming in, and whether it's virtually or in person, connecting with other individuals who share a common goal of celebrating, selling, and socializing the products and services that are being manufactured and offered in those spaces. So community, again, is not something that's parallel to business. It intersects at various roads within that process. Next slide, please. I want to talk about how there's been this real conversation around the humanization of business. But as far back as Aristotle's time, people have recognized that humans cannot be separated from business. That, again, it's all one thing, whether personal or professional. The connections we make as human beings really dictate how we navigate the spaces that we find ourselves in on a regular basis. I love this quote: wealth maximization as an end in itself is likely to undermine society and must instead be directed towards a higher purpose, a purpose that is in line with the larger goals related to the welfare of all. If that's not what business is for me, I don't know what is. Next slide, please. I think it's really important to think about, before we get into my own personal community tenets, to talk about what community is presently in the business case and space and what it has the opportunity to be if we are intentional with some key expectations, terms, and focuses. So, we talk about communities in the business space being web-based gathering places for customers, experts, partners, and others to discuss problems, post reviews, brainstorming new product ideas and ideation, and engage with one another around a subject, whether that be a product or service or a common interest. But I think it's really important before we delve into community spaces from a business case standpoint, really talk about the things that are needed before we can start building out real process. And these are a couple of my tenants. And you may have different tenants as community managers, but I find these 8 tenants really help me define before I begin building and developing some sort of community uh, engagement platform or process. These 8 tenants have to show up. Next slide, please. Accountability. I think we all have to understand that in any partnership, each partner, whether it be the company or the consumer, own a piece of the success of that partnership. And so there needs to be a real understanding that both or all parties own some of the success and failure of this opportunity. Active listening is huge. I'm sure we all understand how important it is to listen twice as much as we speak, because in these spaces, especially when we're creating community, oftentimes if you're not listening to the needs of community members, you're only projecting out what you find valuable. So that active listening piece is huge. And in tandem with active listening, clear communication. Often people just say communication, but if you're talking and I'm not receiving the message you're offering me because of my own personal ideas and perspectives, then we're getting 2 different messages. So being able to not only communicate, but be able to ask the questions that confirm that the individuals comprehend the conversation at hand is really important. Intention. What's the point or the purpose of this community? That's really important. And intention and purpose can be 2 different things, and that's why I separate them. Intention is the individual's ownership. Purpose is a broader umbrella of what we all hope to achieve. And in that space, patience is really important. One of my biggest challenges when getting leadership and cross functional buy in is people expecting things to happen overnight. And I love the garden analogy that's been used throughout this conference, because as gardeners, you don't plant a seed and then dig up that seed every day to see if it's sprouted. You have the faith and the foresight to understand that it takes a little bit of time for the sun and the rain and the wind and the soil to work on that seed to ultimately allow it the ideal environment to sprout. And so, purpose, patience, respect, the idea that we can agree to disagree, because as humans, we all come with our own unique perspectives, and listening to understand versus listening to judge or instruct often serves me best, because I respect your individual experience, and in that space believe that I can learn something from you. And lastly, most important to me, vulnerability. Being able to show up as your authentic self in a safe space that allows us to benefit from all of you. So, those are the 8 tenets that I find really important in the space of community as we talk about creating a larger, dedicated, safe space for broad engagement and conversation. Next slide. I'm wondering, as I list out those 8 tenets, which one of those tenets you would list as number one? I didn't put it as number one, but vulnerability is number one for me. I think to be able to show up imperfect and be able to talk and tell your truth is so very important when we talk about commuting and building it. Listening, it looks like. If you could list which tenet you think of those 8 should be number one. I love listening. Listening is really important. Vulnerability is my favorite. Yeah. Yeah. Authentic self. Oh my gosh, I could talk about that all day, but we don't have time. We don't have time. Patience. Yes. Yes. Thank you so much. We'll keep those going. I'll check those out. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the journey. Now that we've got in my mind these tenets that we're clearly focused on bringing to the table when we're having these community conversations, let's talk about the journey to launching or injecting life into a community. Next slide. For me, it's a process. Yes, it's an acronym. I use it all the time. Community is a process. Before you can launch your community or invest heavily in metrics, you have to take this process. It's about purpose. What's the reason for this community? Why are we building it? Resources, resources, resources. I have heard from many that organizations expect community managers to build community with no resources, no budget, no engineering support. Get out of here. Get out of here. We need resources. Objectives. What are the objectives? What are the expectations for this community? Before we can start talking numbers, how about you determine what we need and why it's important? Communication, we talked about that. Being able to talk amongst internal and external stakeholders to find out what we really hope to accomplish in this dedicated safe space. And then that extra C in process stands for clarity. Because again, communication can only be successful if we're clear, if we're all aligned, if we are all unified in the mission. So make sure that clarity is a part of the conversation. Environment. Where will this community be hosted? What type of environment are we offering these interested individuals? And how does that environment support the overall missions and goals? Again, support. You need the tools, you need the talent. And when I think about support, I'm thinking buy-in. Do you know how hard it is to start or maintain a community when you don't have buy-in? I do. It's really hard. It's really hard. So being clear that support is needed and also having some plan towards sustainability. This isn't launch the community, we're done, take it away, community manager. It's all on you. It's a community is a group sport. It's a group sport. So what are we all working towards from a sustainability plan point? What's the plan? From a sustainability standpoint, what's the plan? Next slide, please. And once we have the process down, then we can celebrate the results, which are, next slide, brand loyalty. It's easy. When you've been intentional about planning, when you've been purposeful about your tenants, why this is valuable and important to you, the natural byproduct is brand loyalty because your customers, your partners, your community members have a clear understanding of who you are. Next slide. Advocacy. It's going to happen. Not only do they support you and are loyal, but they want to talk about you. Next slide. And then the metrics. The metrics come because you've done your homework. You've invested your blood, sweat, and tears. The energy is clear and pure. Next slide. Communities have always been catalysts for connection, and that is ultimately an enabler for authentic engagement. Metrics are not motivators. Stop stressing people out with banging metrics down their throats. Metrics are important, but it is not the motivator. Metrics are the natural byproduct of the effort and intention put in creating a safe space for partners. Next slide. My favorite community proverb. Sticks in a bundle are unbreakable. Let's be unified in our approach, both with internal and external stakeholders, about what makes your specific community valuable and what's needed in those spaces to be the best students and teachers we can be to creating these communities. And if we can do that successful, there's no limit. There's no limit to what we can do, whether that is metrics or if that's engagement. It's all a part of the journey. Don't stress about it. Be intentional. Next slide. I think that's all I got. Thank you. Okay, I did go over a little bit. I want to make sure there's room for questions if you have any or some conversation. Beth.
Hi, Jay. Well, I will say that the chat has been nonstop this entire time. Your energy has been so incredible. You are very quotable. I think there are a lot of people who are probably tweeting direct quotes from you in this moment. That was fantastic. We do have a couple of questions. I asked one, so I want to get my question answered. When a community manager inherits a community, how can they start to build social trust if it hasn't really existed before?
You know what? I had to do that in an organization I worked for previously. And really, it was showing up as my authentic self. I created a lot of video content, hosting conversations, sharing windows into my world, my own objectives for the organizations, for the community, but really asking tons of questions. What can I do? Who can I be for you? What are your pain points? So often customers feel frustrated that the only channel for pain points is support when that shouldn't be. It should be a space where we can have a real conversation. My organization is not perfect, it's purposeful. So, in that space of purpose, let's figure out what's needed. Let's be realistic about what I can do for you, what the organization can do. And let's own as partners our own individual pieces to make this partnership successful.
I love that. I feel like that conversation you have with members could also be a segue into how you have that conversation with your organization, which takes me into, I'm going to say your name wrong, and I'm very sorry. Matthias Treblinski says, how do you convince the higher ups who still think of people and community in terms of metrics and profits, who won't show much of the will to listen actively or to take on how do you convince them to take on a more community oriented approach?
I think it's about having an honest conversation, and you can be honest and respectful. They're not, it's not exclusive, but I think it really is important to put on the plates of leadership a little bit of ownership in this game because, again, community is not a solo sport. And so, what are your expectations and outcomes, and what piece of that do you own as a leader? Because we all own a piece of this. And if you're not buying in, if you're not owning a stake, often if you don't have any skin in the game, then you really cannot be I cannot be beholden to someone who's not willing to put in something, if that makes sense. So let's be clear about ownership and expectations, and what do you own in this process?
I love that. And expectations both ways, because you also
Yeah,
need to set expectations of what I'm capable of, especially if
right
you're a
on,
team of one, especially if
right
you don't
on,
have that many resources. Like,
right
what do
on.
you want from me? But what can I actually get you? Those might be two different
Mm.
things.
Oh, I appreciate that. Yes.
Well, thank
You
you
got
so
it, Beth.
much,
You
Jay.
got it.
There, Ooh, I might know. There are still some questions here. Maybe Jay, you could jump into the chat after after this is over and maybe answer some of those questions. But
I would
I
love
am not
to.
alone in saying that that was such a pleasure. Please flood the chat with emojis. Thank you very much, Jay.
Till next time, take care.